Hello and welcome to Subversive Radio, and as always, I'm your host, Keith Giles. Wanted to talk about in this podcast how to fight like a Christian. The whole topic of Jesus teaching on nonviolence has really just been rising up in me again lately. And there's a couple of things I wanted to address in this podcast, so hopefully we'll get a chance to cover everything. I guess the thing that kind of set me off a little bit this week on this topic and kind of got me thinking again about Jesus and nonviolence, I read earlier this week, I read two different articles and two different comments in regards to the Christian teaching of really just following Jesus in his teachings on nonviolence. And in the sense that it's a kingdom concept. It isn't pacifism per se. It's not the kind of pacifism that we see apart from Christ, which is, maybe something that you would see in the world, again, and not in Christian circles. But if, let's say, if you took a college course at Berkeley or something like that on pacifism, and you might study Gandhi or Martin Luther King or different things like that, which, again, is helpful, but it isn't specifically Christian nonviolence. And so anyway, earlier this week I read two articles and read two different comments on this whole issue of Christian nonviolence. And someone had raised the question, which is what I'm going to talk about, or at least begin with in this podcast, the idea of, is Jesus' teaching on nonviolence really practical? In other words, when Jesus tells us to turn the other cheek or to love our enemies or those kind of things, is this really a practical teaching? And I think what got me, what kind of just immediately came to my mind when I read that question was, wow. If we're going to start questioning the teachings of Jesus, and specifically that, we're going to begin with nonviolence, but that question, is Jesus teaching on nonviolence practical, really begs a larger question, which is anything that Jesus taught practical? Really? Is it practical to love your enemies? Is it realistic to bless those who curse you or to love those who hate you? Is it convenient for us to turn the other cheek? This is really the wrong question. This isn't the point. And I guess I could understand if someone isn't a Christian asking that point. But if someone who is a follower of Jesus, the real point, the real question is, if you call yourself a follower of Jesus and you refuse to do what he said, you are not actually following Jesus. You're fooling yourself. Because we don't obey the teachings of Jesus because they're practical. We don't obey the teachings of Jesus because they're logical. Let's just think about this just at its face value for a moment. The gospel of Jesus is a radical message. It's upside down. It's a kingdom message that's upside down from the world we live in. It collides with the practicality and the logic, if you will, of the world we live in. But how could anything hope to change the world we live in by using the same logic of the world we live in? If you have a desire to change the world, doesn't it make sense that you would have to use ideas that didn't originate from the world you're trying to change? Right? If you're trying to change a system, you won't change it by using the programming within the system that exists, if that system's programming is the problem in the first place. You would have to introduce something new, something different, frankly, something that maybe things within that program would find objectionable or curious or strange. Well, of course they would, because if they had thought of those things themselves or were employing those ideas already, you wouldn't need to bring in these new ideas, and there wouldn't be a problem. So, of course, to the world, it's going to look like Jesus' teachings on nonviolence are impractical and unrealistic. That is the point. They're supposed to. Because Jesus' teachings, not just on nonviolence, but on everything in the kingdom, are intended to upset that apple cart and to go against the grain of the world system. Now, what's curious, having said all that, what's curious to me is that in the area of nonviolence, those who aren't Christians seem to be the ones who don't have the problem with seeing Jesus as nonviolent. That's the real irony. The people who have trouble seeing Jesus as a nonviolent Messiah are his actual followers, largely. Really, when it comes to this idea of nonviolence and what we would call pacifism, Jesus kind of invented this idea in the Western world. People like Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. Point to Jesus as their inspiration, as their guide, as their blueprint for the practice of nonviolent resistance and radical love in action to change the evil systems of the world. And they were successful in doing that. So there's the answer to your question. Is it practical? Yes. Because not only in the examples of Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. do we have examples of a peaceful resistance accomplishing, overthrowing evil and political powers, very powerful entrenched political systems and evil and powers. Another great example, a lot of people aren't familiar with it. I encourage you to go and look it up. I think you can actually still watch it, the entire documentary for free online if you go to pbs.org and look up Pray the Devil Back to Hell. And it's a documentary, an amazing documentary about these women in Liberia, the African nation of Liberia, who simply through prayer and nonviolent resistance overcame warlords and an evil dictator and overthrew him and took back their nation, took back their children who were being turned into child soldiers. It's a phenomenal documentary in recent history. I mean, this has been only in the last decade or so that this took place, where this thing began in a church. It began at a prayer meeting. It actually was a combination of all faiths. It wasn't just all Baptists or all Catholics or anything like that. In fact, not even just all Christians. There were some Muslim women as well who came together and decided they were all going to work together. They were going to resist this armed takeover of their city and of their nation. And they basically just sat in the market and they stopped the buying and selling. And they just prayed and sang songs together and prayed and asked God to change the hearts of their dictator, to change the hearts of these people that were coming in with guns and basically it was like, the Wild West. And they were able, they were successful. They accomplished what they set out to do. In fact, I also had seen, and I apologize, I don't have the reference in front of me at the moment, but if you're curious about it, go ahead and email me or ask me about it on Twitter or on my blog, and I'd be happy to look it up and send it to you. But I also had seen recently a lecture, again, by, I believe this person is not a Christian. This was a woman who was giving a lecture at a secular university, and I believe it was a secular university, if I'm remembering correctly. But she taught an entire class about really just how nonviolence is an effective tool, just in a very practical sense, to resolving conflict, political, military conflict. And so, again, these things are documented. It is practical. So that just to answer the question that we started the show with, yes, it really is practical, but we don't follow it because it's practical. We follow it as followers of Jesus because Jesus is Lord, and it was explicit commands that he gave his followers. The command he gave them was a command to love. The command to seek the good and the well-being and the peace, the shalom of everyone, including their enemies. And so this is the reason why we follow Jesus in this area. Now, I was gonna touch on something that I think is going to take me off. Let me get back to my point about the title of the podcast. how to fight like a Christian. The idea of nonviolence doesn't mean we do nothing. The idea of Christian pacifism doesn't mean we sit and do nothing. We actually have a lot to do, and we might even have to put ourselves in danger, and hopefully I'll have time to get to that part of what I want to say in the podcast as well. But specifically on the subject of how should a Christian fight? Well, first of all, it should be clear that according to Jesus, we are never to fight with weapons, and we are never to direct our energy and direct our resistance to another human being of flesh and blood. So that's the first thing. To fight like a Christian, you have to know your enemy. And according to 1 Peter chapter 5, starting in verse 8, we can identify our enemy. It says, "Be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour." That's your enemy. And now let me tell you who is not your enemy. Ephesians chapter 6, starting in verse 12, it says, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers and against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." That is our enemy. Our enemy is the devil, is evil, is a satanic spiritual force. Our enemy is not flesh and blood. No human being is your enemy. Now, that human being might be a pawn of those spiritual forces. He may be doing the will, unbeknownst to him. He may not even realize it, but he may be doing the will of the enemy, who is your enemy. But your directive is not to kill the human being who is just the pawn. Your directive is to do war, to go to battle, to fight against the true enemy, the devil, and spiritual forces of this dark world. You need to know your weapons. If you're going to fight like a Christian, you need to know what your weapons are. And according to 2 Corinthians chapter 10, the weapons we fight with, it says, are not the weapons of the world. So that right off the bat, the weapons that we fight with are not handguns, shotguns, machine guns, machetes, knives, tasers, nunchucks, bow staffs, etc. But what does it go on to say? On the contrary, our weapons have divine power to demolish strongholds, to destroy castles, to destroy strongholds of the enemy, the battlements of the enemy, our weapons. And our weapons, they're powerful. And again, as a follower of Jesus, you have to believe. You have to put your faith and your hope in the truth that your weapons are more powerful. The spiritual weapons at your disposal are more powerful than a .357. They're more powerful than a shotgun. They're more powerful than a machine gun or a bomb or anything else. That because your enemy is spiritual, a physical weapon will do nothing to him. And if your true enemy, if you understand your true enemy is spiritual, then your weapon is also spiritual. We should understand our mission. If we're going to fight like a Christian, we have to understand our mission. And Jesus says in Matthew 5, "I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven." And he says again in Luke chapter 6, starting in verse 27, "But to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. If someone slaps you on one cheek, turn to them the other also. If someone takes your coat, do not withhold your shirt from them." As a Christian, if we're going to learn how to fight, we need to wear our armor. And we know Ephesians 6 tells us, put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. Again, he is our enemy, not any human being. We need to understand the nature of our struggle. In 2 Corinthians chapter 1, it says, "If we are distressed, it is for your comfort and salvation. And if we are comforted, it is for your comfort, which produces in you patient endurance of the same suffering we endure." In other words, our struggle involves suffering, our own suffering, not the suffering of others, but our own suffering. In other words, we will suffer in this battle. We will be wounded in this fight. In fact, we might even die in the course of this battle. And not only that, it might be the goal, is that we would go and stand against evil, resist evil, to the point of our own physical death, not just spiritual, I'm dying to myself, carrying my cross daily, dying to my urges, dying to my wants and whims and sinful desires, although that is part of it. But it might also involve us being involved to the point of our own, we may get slapped in the face so that we can turn the other cheek. We might actually be mistreated so that we can bless them. We might actually be the object of someone's hate so that we can love them. We have to be confident, because it says in Isaiah 54 that no weapon formed against us shall prosper. We also need to understand that we have a covert strategy, that our strategy in this battle is not a full frontal assault, that it involves a little bit of subversion. As Jesus says in Matthew 10, verse 16, I am sending you out like sheep among wolves. Therefore be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. In other words, the only way a sheep is going to defeat a wolf is by being more intelligent, more crafty. A head-on assault, a sheep against a wolf, the sheep goes down every time. But if the sheep is smart enough to use some covert, subversive strategy, he can tear down the wolf pack from within and get them to turn against themselves. We have to claim the victory before we begin if we're going to fight as Christians. Jesus says, I will build my church and the gates of hell will not overcome it, Matthew 16:18. So we already know we are winners from the beginning. It will look like we're losing, just so you know. In this kingdom, it may look like in the course of the battle that we are losing the fight. However, in the end, we are victorious. So no human beings are enemy. Our warfare involves prayer and love and blessing those who hate us and loving those who curse us and doing good to those who mistreat us. Lives may be lost in the battle, and your own life is most certainly counted among them. If blood must be shed, it must be our own blood. We must look out for the well-being of our fellow soldiers. So that means we must care for one another, love one another, serve one another, comfort one another. And we must also comfort our enemies and love them as well. We are sheep and we're not wolves, and that means we have to trust in our shepherd for protection. The thing about sheep, is that I think sheep are an interesting analogy. There are a lot of animals let's say in the animal kingdom that we might consider to be defenseless. Bunny rabbits and kittens and things like that. We say, wow, those animals are really helpless, defenseless animals. But you know what? They're not more defenseless than sheep. I don't think there is much more defenseless than a sheep. Because a rabbit can run really fast. A cat has claws, or can climb a tree to get away from an enemy. A skunk can spray something smelly at them and make it get away. We can think of a lot of animals that have a natural defense system to protect themselves or to escape attack. Deer and antelope can run really fast and that kind of thing. But sheep, they don't run fast. Sheep can't climb trees. Sheep can't dig holes in the ground to hide. Sheep, although they're kind of smelly, they're not smelly enough usually to prevent a wolf or someone from killing them. So pretty much sheep, if without a shepherd, are toast. And that means we must remain completely, always attached to and next to and near and dependent on our shepherd, our good shepherd, for protection. And that is how Christians fight. But I want to just be honest in this idea, because there's something happened this week in this, because I was thinking about this podcast tonight, I thought, you know what, I can't do this podcast without mentioning this. My wife and I, most evenings, will take a walk about 2 miles, which is there's a mile square, kind of a block around our neighborhood. And after dinner, usually when the sun goes down, it's kind of cool. My wife and I will walk around that. We'll make 2 laps, and that's 2 miles. And on more than one occasion, those walks have turned into opportunities to do some very real spiritual warfare. And in particular, something happened just last night, actually. We were walking around the neighborhood on our first lap. And as we were walking by, we passed a car that was parked on the side of the road. And I noticed that in the back seat of the car, it was piled high with belongings. And it was a dead giveaway that people were living in this vehicle. But in the front seat was a woman who was driving and a man next to her. And she was kind of crying and yelling, and his voice was raised. We couldn't tell exactly what they were saying, but I looked as if that he was hitting her, or that he at least took a swing or hit her in the back of the head or something. So there was an argument going on. It was kind of loud, and it seemed like he at least once hit her or attempted to hit her. So Wendy and I kind of walked past the car and stopped, and just looked at each other and said, "Okay, what do we do?" Well, on this particular time, normally I have my cell phone with me, and maybe I'll tell you a story. One time, it's a good thing I had my cell phone; it came in handy. But this one time last night, I had left my cell phone at home. It was charging, so I didn't have it with me. I had nothing really. So it wasn't like, well, I can call 911, or I can even threaten to call 911. I can't even pretend to call 911. I'm just stuck. And we just kind of looked at each other. We started praying together in Jesus' name that God would give us wisdom, and that God would intervene in the situation and bring peace to the situation. And then we heard the woman yelling and saying that he was scaring her. We couldn't see. It was dark, so we couldn't really see into the car. We couldn't see them, or we couldn't see what exactly was happening. But we continued to pray a little bit, and then Wendy said, I feel like we need to go over there and confront them, and just talk to them. And I said, okay, let's go. So we walked over, and the woman's window was down, and we leaned in. And before I continue my story, let me just explain to you kind of what's going on in my mind at the moment. I realized these are the moments when the teaching of Jesus to turn the other cheek, to stand up for those who are being oppressed, means to be like him in that sense. It means to put our bodies between the aggressor and the victim. It means taking the physical abuse so that the person who's being abused can escape and can be rescued from that. So in this moment, walking up to a dark vehicle where some abuse or some kind of very serious argument or confrontation is taking place, I realized in that moment, this person could have a gun. He could shoot me or my wife, or both of us. This person could be drunk or under the influence of drugs. He could get out of the car. He could confront me. He could challenge me to a fight. He could just start swinging. He could stab me. I have at this point no idea what's about to happen. However, my wife and I walked over to that car knowing that what we were doing was something that Jesus would bless. We went over to that car knowing that this is something that was in obedience to our Lord. And so I'm telling you, when I said to that woman, I leaned down and looked into the vehicle. And when I said to this woman, I said to both of them, are you guys okay? Is there anything we can do to help? There was something in the kingdom that happened when I said that. And I felt it. I felt an immediate that the darkness had broken by simply coming in and addressing both of them and offering myself as a servant to them. Is there anything we can do to help you guys? Now, when I got close enough, now I could see the woman was crying. And the guy backed down. Thank God. He apologized for them having a very loud argument. We asked her again, do you need anything? Do you need us to call someone? Are you okay? And she said she was fine. She wiped the tears away. They were just having a little bit of a loud argument. She said she just wanted to go home. But we made an offer to them if we could help them. Now, that's as far as it went. We didn't have any more conversation with them. They were pretty eager to kind of like get away and drive away. So I don't know exactly what happened, how it all worked out. But I didn't know that it was the right thing to do in that moment to go up and put ourselves potentially in harm's way to protect someone else. And when we do that, that's the reality of it. When we do that, we are putting ourselves in God's hands. We're putting ourselves in a moment of risk. I actually had someone write on my blog in response to one of my recent blogs about nonviolence and following Jesus into nonviolence. And someone made a comment and thanked me for bringing up that idea of what happens when someone breaks into your house. What do you do? And this person shared that actually had happened to them. And that someone broke into their house and they just began to pray in Jesus' name, and the person left, and they were protected. They weren't harmed. That God intervened and things worked out. So they didn't have to do violence. B, they weren't harmed, and God stepped in and took them out of that situation. And I think we have to have faith that sometimes that will happen. That we have to believe that, again, that our weapons are more powerful than the weapons in this world. And what it really comes down to is we're putting ourselves all in with Jesus. We're saying, Jesus, we trust you, that you are the King of Kings, you are the Lord of Lords. And again, when Jesus calls us to turn the other cheek, to put ourselves in harm's way, to step between the aggressor and the victim, again, this is the kind of nonviolence that isn't passive. This isn't the pacifism that does nothing. This is a huge risk. But we have to understand, Jesus isn't calling us to just simply be doormats. We're not called to be doormats. The goal here is not to get beat up. What the goal is, and this is what we need to catch a vision for, is that Jesus wants to confront the kingdom of this world, the kingdom of darkness, with the kingdom of love and the kingdom of light. And if in the moments when we confront hatred and evil and violence, and we meet it with the love and compassion of Jesus, that's a catalytic moment. Something happens in that moment. So we're not called to just be doormats. We're called to introduce love to people who are currently unaware of it, who have never experienced the love of Jesus, the transformation of Christ, the transforming love of Jesus. They've never experienced it. They've never felt it. And if we meet them at that point, at that moment, with love, with the love of Christ, with compassion and humility, then it's a catalytic moment where the kingdom of God is released. It breaks through in that moment. And the potential is astounding. It's like a nuclear bomb going off in that moment, in the spiritual realm. And it takes an incredible amount of faith, an incredible amount of courage. And you know what, frankly, there are no guarantees in those situations. It might be the way that we die. And most of the early Christians who were willing to die for their faith did just that. They died for their faith. But that wasn't seen as failure. That was seen as an honor and a privilege to follow the example of Christ, to follow Jesus all the way to a cross-like death where you could die saying, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. And that your death, your whole life is brought meaning in a death that has meaning, that gives glory to God and introduces a radical love that the world doesn't know what to do with, and the kingdom of darkness has no idea what to do with and has no grid for. And that is what it's about, and that is what it means to fight like a Christian. Thank you for listening, and hopefully we will meet again on the other side. God bless, and let the kingdom come.